about our upcoming Black Lives Matter vigil on Saturday, and also a survey that you can fill out at the end of the session so that we can get feedback and continue to get better in our programming. And I'm going to introduce our panelists in just a moment, but first I just wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of what to expect tonight. So tonight we're going to hear from each of our panelists. There are 7 total, and we're going to start by hearing from each of them about their approach to anti-racist parenting. And once we've heard from each person and they've shared a little bit about how they go about anti-racist parenting, I'm going to ask them about how specifically we can nurture and empower our children of color, how we can raise our white children to be anti-racist, and how to navigate situations where our children might self-identify with a different race than the one that we identify with. Around 8:30 Eastern time or so in about 75 minutes from now, we'll try to take a couple of audience questions, and we'll do our best to end on time at about 8:45. I want to acknowledge that not every person here is a parent, and so we welcome grandparents and older siblings and teachers, all of those who are doing the work of raising our children, which of course is collective work. And we know that every single person that's joining us tonight brings with them a different set of experiences, and there are people in the Zoom room right now who have only just begun considering the question of what it means to be an anti-racist parent. There are people who have been doing the work for years. There are people whose ancestors have been doing the work for generations. And so we know that these different experiences mean that there are different needs in the room. And we've done our best to design this in a way that'll meet diverse needs, but we also know that not every single person's experience is represented in our panel, and that this discussion is a resource and not an exhaustive guide. So we know that we can't be all things to all people tonight, and also that we need to pace ourselves, and that this is not the work of an evening or a week, but of a lifetime. So I hope that everyone gets something out of this discussion, and that this certainly is not the end of the discussion. So I want to tell you a little bit about who's joining us, and then we'll start hearing from them. So first of all, we have Loretta Ross. Loretta is a visiting associate professor at Smith College, teaching white supremacy in the age of Trump. She started her career in the women's movement in the 1970s, working at the DC Rape Crisis Center, the National Organization for Women, the National Black Women's Health Project, the Center for Democratic Renewal, or the National Anti-Klan Network, the National Center for Human Rights Education, and Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective. She has a forthcoming book which is called Calling in the Calling Out Culture. And her most recent publications are Reproductive Justice in Introduction and Radical Reproductive Justice. We also have joining us Anastasia Higginbotham. She is a children's book author. She launched her Ordinary Terrible Things children's book series in 2015 with a book called Divorce is the Worst, and followed that with Death is Stupid and Tell Me About Sex, Grandma. Her most recent book is called Not My Idea, a book about whiteness, which tackles white supremacy and was published in 2018 by Dotier Press. Anastasia Higginbotham makes her books by hand in collage using grocery bag paper and recycled materials, and her books demonstrate a way to cope with change and loss by using whatever raw materials are available to us, like scissors, glue, paper, pens, and the wisdom of our own lived experiences. Kiana Perkins is a faith professional who works at the Unitarian Universalist congregation in Ann Arbor, Michigan. She also has strong ties with Black Lives Matter of UU. She is a Black queer mama of 2 preteens and a dedicated nonviolent pro-Black parent. Akiko Cooks is a mother of 3. She's originally from Los Angeles, California. She's the co-founder of hashtag 1865, No Racism in Schools, an organization born after 9 Black boys, students at Arborview High School in Las Vegas, were racially targeted to be shot and killed on campus. Akiko is the mother of one of the Arborview 9. She does student, parent, educator, and community advocacy work in Clark County School District. And she works to prevent online radicalization of youth, anti-racism education, and decolonizing curriculums across the country. 3 more to introduce. Rachel Parsons is a teacher, writer, editor, activist, and parent of a 2-year-old. She currently lives in Chicago. She's been working with youth for 13 years. She taught high school in New York City public schools and most recently worked with youth as a professor for the City Colleges of Chicago. During her time in New York City public schools, she was active in restorative justice movements and disrupting the school to prison pipeline. And her writing is fueled by her commitment to justice and her desire to understand what makes us fully human, exploring education, race, gender, family, parenthood, sexuality, and politics. Matthias Kirsch is a white transgender man and the parent of 2 tweens. He works as a health services researcher at the University of Michigan, and he is president of the school board at his kids' school. And then finally, we have also joining us Shannon Foley Martinez. So Shannon is a former violent white supremacist with 2 decades of experience in developing community resource platforms aimed at inoculating individuals against violence-based lifestyles and ideologies. And she's worked in at-risk communities, teaching and developing dynamic resiliency skills, working with organizations like the UN Office of Counterterrorism, the National Counterterrorism Center, and the Center for the Prevention of Radicalization Leading to Violence. So it's an impressive group, and I really can't wait to hear what they have to say. Just so you all know a little bit more about me, I identify as white. I'm a father of a 9-month-old biracial child. I've been in education for a little over a decade, and I'm also in my other life, I'm a journalist, and I cover the intersection of race with politics, education, and culture. And I have an education podcast called Teach the People. So without further ado, I'm gonna hand things over to our panelists. And the first question is pretty open-ended, and I got this to them beforehand, but basically I just would love to hear like a 3 or 4, maybe maximum 5-minute overview of how each panelist thinks about their anti-racist parenting. And maybe that includes the rules that you follow that guide you in your parenting. Maybe that includes like an aha moment that you keep coming back to. Maybe that includes a recent anecdote. And if we find ourselves going a little over, maybe the white folks on the panel can keep themselves to 3 or 4 minutes and let the people of color on the panel go to 4 or 5 minutes. So we'll start with Loretta, and then we'll go to Shannon after Loretta. So Loretta, whenever you're ready, we're ready. And thank you again for being here.
Thanks for having me on your show. And I'm joined with a friend of mine. We're probably representing the elderly class because we're both grandmothers, and in my case, great-grandmothers as well. And so I had the difficulty of not only parenting during the 60s and the 70s, but doing so at the time that I was becoming a political activist. So my son grew up in the movement. And because I was a teen mother and my son was born of incest, I was also drawn to the movement to end violence against women. But I always had a complicated parenting situation because I loved my child and hated his circumstances. My son also grew up in the days of AIDS, and so his whole sex education was dedicated to keeping him alive, much more so than borrowing the morality of a society that didn't care about keeping him alive. As a child of a very feminist mother, I tried to make sure that my son had values that I fought for. And as a matter of fact, before he got married, he used to amuse me because he dated the United Nations. And I used to say, well, I mean, really? I mean, who are you bringing home next time? And he's like, Ma, ain't this what you said to do? Kind of thing. And I was like, I better get used to this kind of thing. And as a result, my grandson is white, half white. And so parenting a Black child while you're also having to educate him on gender and racial and class issues all at the same time. Because the other thing I should say about my parenting experience is that as a poor Black single mother, my son went to college and became very angry at me because I didn't send him to college as a middle class parent. He didn't have a car, he didn't have a TV, he didn't have all the things that his more fortunate roommate had. And so from like 18 to 20, he lost his mind and was angry at me around class issues, which was quite complicated as well. Now, parenting an anti-racist child is something that you have to do from the beginning. Children develop their racialized attitudes as early as 5 years old. And so even waiting till they get to kindergarten or elementary school is entirely too late. By the time that they recognize who you consider trustworthy and who you don't consider trustworthy, that's branded in their brains by both the media that they watch and the subjects you forbid them to talk about. Because when you forbid them to talk about stuff like not notice race, then they learn to be fearful of talking about race. Guess what? And so they get these hardened attitudes that manifest in the selections of what dolls they consider pretty, what military weapons they want to imitate as toys. Another thing that was problematic about my parenting was that my father was in the military, and he was a very wonderful man, a great father, but he was also a member of the NRA. And no matter how many nonviolent toys I wanted to buy for my son, I could not prohibit the grandparent toys that arrived, the G.I. Joes and the Rock'em Sock'em robots, nor did I put up a big struggle over it, because my son was not an emblem of my ideology. He was an independent person who could make his choices about what he wanted to play with. We talked about it, but I wasn't going to forbid it, because again, when you make something forbidden, that's the one thing they most want to run towards. And so I didn't want to complicate his understanding of the world while I tried to lodge in his brain those things that were really important, I thought, for his development into a man. And I've talked a while, but parenting, well, I'll just say this in closing. I believe that it is bad parenting to keep children both sexually and racially ignorant, and then send them to college and expect us to mature them overnight, when as professors, our job is to teach them, not to, and I teach predominantly white kids. And the first thing I say is that I don't mammy. I mean, I will offer you information, but I won't mammy. This is not something that I'm that terribly interested in doing. But of course, teaching a course called White Supremacy, called In the Age of Trump, I'm encountering a lot of people's feelings about their whiteness and all that stuff. And I'm really good at talking about that, but not in a mothering, comforting kind of role, because that's not where I am. But I'm also not angry, because I think it's a difficult enough topic to discuss without having to hear through the lens of my anger. I'm a pretty powerful person. I think if I became angry, it would really compromise my effectiveness as a professor. And so I think I should shut up, because I could talk forever. I'm a professional talker.
I would love to hear you talk forever, and I certainly hope that all of you will, that this is only the first time we're all in dialogue, and hopefully won't be the last. But you actually did keep that to right about 5 minutes, and stuck a lot of wisdom in a short amount of time. I especially liked what you said about your son not being an emblem of your ideology. So thank you for sharing. We'll go to Shannon next, and we'll have Anastasia on deck.
Thank you all so much for having me. What DJ left out of my bio is that I am also the mom of 7 kids from age 23 down to 4, and a stepmama of 1 child. So 8, and then we have boyfriends and friends and other people that seem to live with us all the time. As soon as some kids go, new ones come in. So I was a neo-Nazi skinhead from the time I was 15 until I was 20. And if you want to know more about that, just look me up online. But I feel like in this, in this current time, that I have kind of a head start as a white parent trying to raise herself and her children as anti-racist, because I came to adulthood having absolute clarity that overt racism was something that I was capable of. I never had to pretend like that wasn't something that could potentially be a part of me. I also knew like that I had a lot of work to do, and that I needed to really understand race, my own race and my relationship with whiteness, as well as immerse myself in the books and literature of Black and other non-white authors to understand their experiences, so that I could try to minimize the amount of harm that I was doing and maximize the good that I was doing. Because I knew only like two things when I became a mom when I was 23 years old. I'm about to be 46. Was just that like I wanted to cultivate human beings who would thrive, and I didn't want them ever to end up like me. I didn't want them to ever look to hate or violence as any sort of viable solution to any of life's problems or difficulties. So over the last 25 years, and I'm still a work in progress. I continue to be a work in progress. This is a lifelong journey. This is not something that is just, we take a couple classes and read a couple books and we're good to go. I will be disentangling my relationship with whiteness and how I wield and wear that whiteness in the world for my whole life. But over the years, I have like some basic tenets that I sort of like parent by, that one of the main ones is to be a transparent and vulnerable work in progress, to let my kids see me struggling, grappling, not just with issues around race, but everything, to learn how to like apologize when I've done something wrong, or if I learned something new, going back and being very transparent and be like, wow, that was really bad. Or if I chose some kind of, bad sort of like discipline, like strategy or whatever, going back and being like, wow, I think that was really bad. And let's talk about how you felt about that. And I think that in terms of anti-racist parenting, that's really, really important, because that's how we grapple with like fragility, and, like getting in spaces where it's like, and allowing our children to see like, we're all just like works in progress. And that's not just okay, but that's just how we are. And to embrace that and see that as a sense of empowerment. One of the other things that, is to allow dissent, that my kids have a voice in everything that we do, even the rules that govern them, like everything that we do, and they are absolutely allowed to say no. And then we will talk about that, and everything is on the table for discussion. And if I've made some rule and it turns out I don't really have a good justification for it, if they challenge it, I'll change it. Because if it doesn't serve us, then what is the point of having that rule in the first place? And also like modeling and fostering equity. If you look at your home as like the micro community where people really, really learn about community, well, whatever you say you want in the outside community, children have to learn that in our home. And so for me, like making sure everyone's needs are consistently met and talking about how that doesn't mean that everyone's needs are exactly the same, but trying to make sure that everyone understands everyone has need sets, and that we want to consistently meet all of their needs all of the time. And then that all emotions are valid, and focusing on, not on their specific emotion, but how to process those emotions, and giving words and learning how to sit and just feel things like I'm afraid, or I don't know what to say right here, or I feel shame. I really messed this thing up and I feel shame, and giving them the skills and tools to process. That most of how I parent and everything has really come down to, how do I yield power? That if I don't want to raise children who are imprinted with patterns of oppression and take those out into the world, then I have to not model that in my own family, that I have to be very hyper aware and vigilant and ready to morph and change and grow in terms of how I yield power, so that I'm modeling equity and justice and empathy and compassion, and making sure that those who have the least voice are heard, and that the vulnerable are elevated and empowered inside my home, if that's something that I want them to take out into the world.
Thank you so much, Shannon. We'll go to Anastasia next, and then Kiana will be on deck.
Okay. Hi, so for one of the ways that I have been showing my children how much anti-racism means to me is by horribly neglecting them for the past couple of weeks. Not to the detriment of their safety, but certainly to the detriment of their comfort. They see where my focus is. They see how I spend my time. They see that anti-racism is not something I do, it's something I am. They see that it it nurtures my energy, it gives me energy, and that's where I put my attention and concentration. It's where I get my joy. They see me made the most happy and fulfilled in my experiences as an anti-racist, in the relationships that I have been able to grow in those circles, and in those in my friendships that have that in common. Me and that friend, we have that in common. That friendship is like, that really flourishes. So they see that, and they see that when the world is the way it is, well, just the fact that it is all the time, but like what's happening right now, and for the past couple of weeks, I mean, I'm like, you're all right. They're, my children are both white. They're 10 and 15, both boys, and they know what this means to me, partly because I don't, there's only celery in the refrigerator and a granola bar in the cabinet. And they're like, we're hungry. And I'm like, well, then you're 10 and you're 15 and you know how to put a mask on and go to the store. Take some money and go get yourself something to eat, because I cannot deal with you right now. And I'm not mean all day, but I am really short-tempered lately. I'm having the experience that I'm having of now. And there's people and there's moments that I want to be present to that are more important than my children's immediate needs. And I feel fine with that, better than fine with that. That to me is a disruption of white supremacy, because it's a disruption in their ability to just expect things to come. That's all I need to say for now.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for that. Kiana up next, and then Akiko on deck.
So my name is Kiana Perkins. My pronouns are she and her. I wanted to clarify, I volunteer and I'm a part of Black Lives of Unitarian Universalist. And although there's a lot of connection and overlap with Black Lives Matter, we are two separate entities. So I just wanted to clarify that. We go by Blue, that's our nickname. And I also want to say this because it's important. Matthias is my co-parent. So I don't want to talk like he's not in the room, because he is. So I just want to own that. And we talked a lot today, and always actually, about how it is we're able to make co-parenting work. We have 2 beautiful Black children. And a lot of what it came down to for us is a healing from our own stuff, our own experiences, our own, we're not coming at our parents, but their reality and how they were taught to parent is so much different than the opportunity we have. So, we realized some patterns that we developed as when we were about to start parenting, we didn't want to replicate. And so a huge part of this process for me has been healing from my experiences and not wanting to pass them on. I didn't understand what autonomy was till I was a much older adult. I'm not gonna lie about that. But now that I grasp it, I want everyone to have it. So my children have a lot of autonomy. They have a lot of say in what they experience. And they feel really empowered to let us know what's going on. And also for us, a huge piece is about power. We don't, my role as parent is not to lord over my kids. My role is to give them the tools and the skills that they need to be good humans, and to be safe humans, right? So if I say you can't do something, there's a reason. It's tied to something. I also love about my kids that they have a lens to say that doesn't sound right or that doesn't feel right. They listen to a lot of NPR, or they did when they drove a lot more to back and forth to school, but they will listen to a lot of NPR and, have very serious conversations. I remember my daughter, and this was like 3 or 4 years ago, having this very serious conversation with my adult roommate about why, Trump, like, she was like, why do people vote for Trump? Like, this is a genuine, 9-year-old question, and wanting to have that dialogue. And I just thought, okay, she's got a good start. She's asking the question. She's looking for logic. She assumes someone's going to hear her. She's going to get validated in her experience. And she's not going to get patted on the head and say, you're a child. And I think something Loretta said really stuck with me as well, which is it starts early. It starts with you. It starts when you understand your patterns and your behaviors, then you can lend those to your children. And I think having clarity about your own stuff is something Shannon spoke about as well. How does whiteness work in your everyday life? How does whiteness work in your kid's life? And how does, for me, I want to say this, how does anti-Blackness show up, right? Like, I remember when they were much younger, I wasn't as woke yet. And I remember thinking, oh, my kids are getting too dark. And I was like, hold up, did you just say that to you? Pull it together, sister. And so it's not just about knowing my stuff, it's about making sure those messages don't come up again. So like, no, we don't say those kind of things. No, I don't let anybody touch their hair. Like, all of those things make sense to me, but then I have to practice them so that they're hearing pro-Black things all the time from every resource and not just building up this, for lack of a better word, I don't want them just to think, oh, is that white person or that non-Black person not treating me well? I want them to call Black people to task too on being treated well and with dignity. And then the other thing I wanted to say, my kids are Black with a capital B. They're not, they are kids of color and they're Black. They're probably Black first and then they're kids of color. And sometimes our inability to call kids Black, to say the word Black, to say Blackness matters is some of the struggle our kids can't get over, right? Because if we can't talk about Blackness, we can't talk about being anti-racist, we can't give that knowledge to our kids, we can't pass that on. So when I say you got to get comfortable with your stuff, you got to get comfortable with putting words in your mouth that feel clumsy and not great. And some of those words are Black. Some of the kids aren't kids of color, they're Black. So think about your own anti-Black behaviors. I am my kids' primary role model for how they interact with other humans, how they interact with their father, how they interact with my, our Black relatives. I'm their primary role model for faith engagement. I am a Black Unitarian Universalist. I role model what that lives like in our everyday. So own that, right? I own that. It's not something I'm like, oh, I guess I'm kind of doing that. No, I'm their role model and we go to church and we talk about faith walk, so I'll just leave that all right there and just say I'm excited to be here.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And since it's come up a couple of times, the fact that it has to start early, right? One thing I just want to throw in is that I work with a lot of parents, as part of my job, and it's only ever the white parents who are worried about starting too soon. And so I just think that's like worth knowing, at least that's been my personal experience. Akiko is up next and Rachel is on deck.
So I want to start with, I am super excited to be here. I have worked with Shannon and Kiana, and that just totally fills my heart. Kiana and I worked on the Black Mama Bailout, and we continue to bail out protesters. We're still boots on the ground doing this work while being Black in America and being attacked. So I also grew up in a Black Panther household, so I am a Panther Cub. So I am a revolutionary and an activist by nature, by heart. It's all I know. So raising my children, I empowered them with being able to identify microaggressions when they happen and check them. My children know and understand that they do not have to debate their experience as Black children in America. Our experience being Black in America is not up for a debate. We won't debate it. There won't be a debate. You can listen, you can ask questions, you can learn, but I will not debate with you about what is happening to me and my people. Not a debate. And my children are empowered to do that. They are surrounded by lots and lots and lots of Black women that nurture them. They are surrounded by their educators and teachers who are non-Black. And I see a lot of educators from CCSD on here, and I'm super, super excited about that because we're in a very hostile racist district, and the teachers are kind of climbing through a lot of what's happening. I also educate non-Black children because my children have friends who are not Black. So even when they come to my house, their parents know because I have a relationship with the parents of both these kids. They know if your kids come over here, they're gonna get some political education work. So if you don't want them to hear that, they can't come. And we have these conversations, and it's gotten to the point where the conversations are going on so much that my kids just kick off the conversation and they talk amongst each other and they educate their friends, and their friends are comfortable to come and ask me like, hey, Miss Akiko, what do you think about this? And all these conversations that are happening right now with the climate in the country, with the riots, we're talking about it. So my education and parenting for me it's not with just my children, it's with their friends as well. Because we have to nurture. Our youth are going to kick this revolution off. Our youth are the ones who are going to stand down and say, we're not taking this. And as I move through my work and I see a lot of what's happening, we have to center our youth and center our children and let them know that question everything. My children are allowed to question me about things. If they have a question, ask me. You don't have to just take what I'm telling you. I need you to do your own research. You are allowed to question things that don't make sense. We use critical thinking skills in this house, and I encourage that with all the children that come around me because I embrace all of these kids. Every child on this planet that I can touch, 1 to 1,000, Shannon, I will. And we need all of these children to understand what anti-Blackness is, what anti-racism is, how to be anti-racist, not just talk about it. How to be anti-racist every day, every night. Check it when you hear it. And I am very, very stern when I say I don't make white people comfortable when I'm talking about racism. It is a very, very uncomfortable subject. Imagine living it all your life. So be uncomfortable for 15, 20, 30 minutes. We don't hear 65 minutes? It's gonna get a little uncomfortable. But imagine having to live it all your life. Because we go through this every day. So for me, with raising anti-racist children around me, because my children aren't, but they definitely experience it. But I have also empowered them to know how to check it, and check it with authority, with their chest up and their Black fist in the air, like all the way. No, this is what we're not going to do. So I'm very happy to be here. I'm happy to see all these faces who are ready to have this conversation, come into this uncomfortable space, unpack it, and let's get through this because these are our kids that we're talking about. And I will pass it on.
Thank you so much, Akiko. So we have 2 left, Rachel and then Matthias, and then we'll get into the question. After those 2 speak, we'll get into the question of what we can do to nurture and empower the children of color that we're raising and that are in our lives. But first up, Rachel.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I'm learning so much from my fellow panelists, and just glad to be in conversation. So I'm a white parent. I have a white child and a white partner. And she's 2, my daughter is 2. And so I guess one of the values that are important to me as working anti-racism practice into my parenting or embodying that is not staying at the surface, right? And it's always going deeper to below what's going on that we can actually see. And so I've been thinking about this, since I'm raising a 2-year-old, she's in the space of like learning how to communicate her demands and preferences and, the things that she wants and needs. And so my partner and I are trying to teach her how to do that in a way that gets positive results and, is effective. And when she was, the conversation started with my partner being like, her name is James, you need to be nice, you need to be polite. And I don't want my daughter to be nice and polite. I think I can speak from my own experience, like being a white woman in the Midwest, like that is what I was taught to be growing up. And I push against that because there's a lot of nice, polite people who enact racism every day, embody white supremacy, don't call people in when they witness it, when they're witnessing anti-Blackness, racism in all of its forms. And that is not going to get us anywhere. And so instead of teaching my daughter to be nice and polite, I want to teach her to be kind and respectful. Because using those values is inviting her into the process of just more deeply connecting with other people. And also, if you're respecting somebody, if you're really respecting somebody and you're seeing their full humanity, there's no room. You're going to be actively working against racism, right? Or that's the idea, because there's no room in racism for that. It's a process, it's a system used to dehumanize people. And if you're actually coming from a place of respect and compassion and kindness, there's no place for that. So yeah, I'm gonna leave it there because I know we don't have a lot of time left, but just always trying to go deeper. A lot of the other fellow panelists have talked about like discussing emotions, going into emotions, acknowledging power, things like that. And those are the things I'm thinking about right now.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Matthias.
Hello, thank you for inviting me. Well, I actually kind of got invited by Kiana because she said, well, we are parents together. We are raising these Black children together. So your voice is just as important. And I thank you for that. When I think about parenting, it's really about listening to the children. Like from a very young age, they are seeing the world around them. They are experiencing the world that is very different from the one we grew up in. And listening, like really paying attention to what they say, acknowledging the way they identify themselves. My daughter from a very young age identified as Black. She knew she had white people in her family and she was, yeah, you're white, but I'm Black. That's who I am. And she didn't feel the need to like make, I guess there's no like, I have to be something else because that's going to make you feel bad. Like, I never want my kids to like have to do that. I want them to identify who they are. And I think that the other piece, and I'll leave this short too, that really shows anti-racist is where are you spending your time and energy as a parent? Like kids notice everything we do. What are the books on my bookshelf right now? What are the TV shows I watch? What are the conversations I'm having with the other adults around me? Like, they don't want to lecture from me about what the things are necessarily, but they're going to pay attention to all those little things that I do. And that's going to make a huge difference in the way that they are. And they're going to notice when I speak up, and they're going to notice when I speak up, things happen. And it's a humbling experience to have kids who are very observant and notice all those little things. And it helps me to be a better parent too. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that. So I one of the common threads for me there for sure that came up again and again was that, being an anti-racist parent is about being an anti-racist in all facets of your life, right? So it's about the books on your bookshelf. It's about the way you're spending your time. It's about the way that you talk to your children's friends. It's not just about, taking 20 minutes when another Black person has been killed by the police and having a really thoughtful conversation. I also want to thank our panelists because we are miraculously exactly on time right now. And I just appreciate that because I know we have a lot of things that we want to talk about. So thank you for for your self-discipline in that way and for packing so much wisdom into so few minutes. So the plan now is to spend the next 15 minutes until about 8:10 talking specifically about how we can nurture and empower the children of color in our lives. And I was planning on leaning predominantly on Loretta, Kiana, and Akiko for that. From there, just so you know where we're going, we're going to talk to Shannon and Anastasia and Rachel about just some more tips for raising anti-racist white children specifically. And then I want to talk to Matthias a little bit more about what you do when there's a gap between your racial identity and your children's racial identity. So the order I had on my plan was Loretta and then Kiana and then Akiko for about 5 minutes each. But if you all want to go in a different order, that's fine. But the question is, what can we do to nurture and empower our children of color, our Black children and our other children of color in this world that we're all sharing?
Well, this is Loretta, you don't mind me going, and I want to introduce my friend Miriam Lussier, who's here with me. She came because I'm cooking a fabulous meal, but and she didn't want to eat her own cooking. Grandmothers together, right?
Sounds wonderful.
Anyway, I don't want to sound, combative, but I don't want to hear a lecture about how to nurture healthy children of color. We're working hell. The fact that they survive is a miracle. I really want to talk about how you nurture better white kids. And if you're a white parent with a child of color, of course, that's a different conversation. And I'm willing to have that conversation, but I'm not willing to use children of color to have that conversation about white parenting. Okay, so I'm not quite sure if I want to answer the question about parenting children of color. We got that down cold, who are parents of color. And if that question is about how white parents do it, then it needs to be asked more directly.
Right. So, I mean, I appreciate that pushback, and I think that we can use that. I think that we should follow your lead on how we use the time. Right. I also just want to say as a disclaimer that I know some of the folks on the panel well, and I know some of them less well, and so we put these questions together pretty quickly. And I did ask all the guests and panelists for feedback on the questions before we started tonight. But Loretta, if you want to talk about how white parents can nurture and empower their children of color, I would be happy to hear that. If you'd rather hold off and spend some time while we're talking about how to raise anti-racist white children in a few minutes, I'd be happy for that too. I'd honestly be happy to hear you talk about both. So I trust you completely, and I'll take your lead.
I'm always ready to run my mouth, but I also want to have the appropriate response for the appropriate question. Because when we start with focusing on raising healthy, self-empowered children of color, it almost starts with a deficit question, as if that's not happening. What I'm finding as a college professor is the white kids are coming to me that are the most naive, the most ill-prepared, the ones that are the most entitled, and the ones that are undergoing a culture shock when they even encounter a hint of diversity and resistance and all of that stuff. And so I guess I want to talk about white parenting in a way that it doesn't matter so much if your child is a person of color or not. I think that is a subsection of the problem, but if you're white parenting children of color, you're probably going to be white parenting white kids the same way or very similarly and making some of the same mistakes too around racial issues. And so I'm not quite sure having a conversation, particularly by a person of color, saying, how can you be a better parent to a child of color? That's something that, is emotional labor, and I'm willing to have a conversation, but not if that's not what the topic should be. It's about what's wrong with the way white parents parent that has replicated white supremacy for 400 years. That's the serious question, because I see people as wanting to be good people, generally speaking, you know, regardless of race.
Right.
But they are socialized and trained into being either racially naive, racially fragile, racially fearful, or racially hostile.
Right.
I mean, I could probably slot them that way. And how we can interrupt that and stop the intergenerational replication of white supremacy, either its overt nature like Shannon experienced, or its more covert nature like the girl in the park with the dog, who's a liberal, by the way.
Right.
That's a mo, and I really want to counsel white people who want to have these new conversations to not make the same mistakes, because this isn't a diversity training. This is a fight against fascism. And so we have to be able to take seriously that the games can be stepped up and the questions can be stepped up and the discussions can be stepped up, because this is not about our lives, all our lives, but it's also about whether or not we're going to continue this experiment called democracy or not.
Yeah, I absolutely hear you. And I think the stakes are that high. We've been doing a series of anti-racist events with adults the last few months and have been focusing pretty much exclusively on unpacking white supremacy. And one of the pieces of feedback that I'm getting from some of the people of color that I work with is that they want to hear a little bit more about how to be in their own families in this time also. And that's part of what drove the question. But I'm fully in agreement with you that that racism is a white people problem that needs to be fixed by white people. And that if we don't, like you said, you know, the stakes are literally like whether we continue as a country. I want to give Akiko and Kiana time because they were promised time during this segment to chime in. Maybe we can go to Kiana first.
So I want to validate Loretta. I think that your question is tremendous and amazing. And I don't want to spend a lot of time telling Black folks how to parent Black kids. I do want to acknowledge though, I'm trying to find the right phrasing, and I may have just forgotten my thought. It could happen either way. Oh, I know what it is. So I know how to parent Black, but I had to really unlearn a lot of classism and a lot of other isms, a lot of, as a queer person, I mean, I came out to myself at like 17 or 18, so I didn't have to unpack a lot of homophobia or transphobia or other things. So I would just say to other Black and people of color parenting, unpack some of that other stuff, because that stuff has influence too. It's tremendously hard, I think, to be very pro-Black and also be very homophobic. Those things exist, but I think that at some point they collapse into each other and they don't feel right? Like, I'm not gonna go on the big bus, I'm just gonna stay on here right now, but so unpack some of those other things. Respectability politics and ideas around gender roles and ideas around how girls should be, how boys should be, all of that stuff, start to unpack that, because it's part and parcel. The way that racism upholds itself and is practiced maintains some of those other systems. It's kind of, you know, it's a big box and you take racism out, but all that other stuff is in there, it doesn't work. So you got to start taking everything out the box, right? Unpack everything. So don't be afraid to dig into some other isms or other stuff that could be problematic, especially if you're raising a kid who is using a lot of logic and self-reassurance and understanding who they are. They're going to come back. That's going to come back at some point. At some point, they're going to say, but you taught me logic. So, you know, treat them as if you've taught them logic and have reasonable conversations and unpack other isms.
Thank you so much. I want to make sure to get to Akiko here.
And again, I'll validate Loretta as well, but I still would like to speak to that initial topic because I do think that it's important. I've come across a lot of Black parents who don't tell their children, no, don't tell somebody they don't see color and that they don't see that you're Black. And I have to educate them on why that's important. As I've been doing this work with high school children, Black parents are missing the mark. And they're coming to me, talking to me. I've had parents say, I never talk to my children about race or about being Black. And right now, young Black boys are saying, oh, I just thought of myself as a man. I didn't realize I needed to tone it, go into the fact that I'm a Black man. So I think that conversation is still important because it's empowering Black children. And for years, and let me back up. I have to remember that everyone wasn't born in the household that I was born in. So everyone wasn't born in a household of feeding the community and taking care of the community and pushing back against racism. Everyone wasn't born into that, because we do have a lot of Black people who do still suffer from classism, who still think that because, and it's up here where I am in Arborview High School, I've had Black people tell me, well, why did you move up there when if you weren't up there with all those white people, that wouldn't have happened. So it's still a very important conversation. And who else would Black parents go to ask that? Because they're not going to go to a white person to ask that. So they need to know that they can have that conversation with me or, whoever else that looks like them that understands the struggle, because not everybody is, even the show, Hella Black or whatever the show is that was on Netflix. Like, you got some people who might have some money and think that they have privilege because they have money as a Black person until they get checked and realize, yeah, you might have $1 million, but you're still Black. Yeah, you might be an FBI agent, but you're still Black. And you get reminded of that when you get arrested or handcuffed. Then you realize, oh, I am Black. Maybe I should empower my children to be Black, because that's what you are. That's what people see first. When you're acknowledging someone or describing someone, what's the first thing you say? Oh, she's a Black woman. You're not gonna leave out, oh, she got braids. You're gonna say she's a Black woman with braids that had some yellow earrings on that had Africa, but the first thing that's going to be said is she's Black. A lot of Black parents have missed that mark. And I am happy when they come back to try to get that back together, because I get them together real quick and help them out before they have to learn the hard way, because it happens. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I know that topic could warrant a session of its own or a series of sessions of its own, just like each of these questions can. But since we do have a limited amount of time with all of you, I want to move to the question of raising anti-racist white children, raising white children who are less fragile, raising white children who are not in danger of becoming violent white supremacists. And the plan here was to go to Shannon and then Anastasia and then Rachel. But we're about 2 minutes ahead, and I know that Loretta wanted to chime in too. So we'll stick with that same order, but then we'll circle back to Loretta after those three parents. So Shannon and then Anastasia on deck. Maybe about 3 minutes each or so on some of your primary strategies for anti-racism in your white children. Thank you.
So it has to start from like birth. Like decolonize your bookshelf. What's there? What do you got? Do you have children's books that have Black characters that aren't just like stories of survival or overcoming, but do you just have, do you have The Snowy Day? Do you have Corduroy? Do you have books that center and speak to experiences of Black people and people of color, or are they all white stories? If you got Dr. Seuss on your bookshelf, get it off of there. Or maybe much older, you can examine some of that and why that's important to you. From very young, we know that by age 3, children internalize anti-Black bias. White kids, Black kids, kids of color. So the conversations that we are waiting to have, we are waiting way too long to have. That we have to embrace this whole getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. So the materials that you have, the songs that you have on, the shows that you have on, the stories that you hear and tell of our Black brothers, sisters, and other brethren. What are those stories? Are they only stories about sports? Are they only stories about enslavement? Or are they stories of triumph and intelligence and and creativity. So that's like an immediate change that I think most parents that are tuning in can go look at the books that they have and the shows that they watch and expand that immediately. And then talk about the things that come up in other shows or whatever that are on. Like my kids were watching an episode of Bugs Bunny, and like one of my kids was like, "Oh, that's all kinds of problematic." And I was like, "Yeah, let's like stop that and let's talk about that and what's problematic and where did that come from and why does that exist and why is that in there?" And examine those things as we encounter them. And it is okay if you don't know what to say. Like, it's much better to be like, you know what? I know that's problematic, but I don't know why. And then go online and do some work. Don't ask your Black friends unless like they have already said, hey, come to me. I'm willing to do that labor. Google search first and start thinking of, like, what the heck was that? What racist Bugs Bunny or whatever? And just start doing the work. And it's okay if we don't know what to say, as long as we continue to follow up and try to learn more and try to educate ourselves so that we are in a better position the next time that we encounter some of that. These difficult conversations are super okay to have. It's super okay not to know the words that you need to say. But if you start that from very early on or from today, whatever, like if today is where your starting point is, then start from today. And just go from there. And you might even want to make an acknowledgement to your kids if they're older. Just be like, you know what? There's stuff that I should have been doing that I didn't know. And I'm sorry. And now I would like this to be part of our lives. Will you guys come and join with me and let's hold each other accountable and grow so that we can, not wield this anti-Black presence everywhere that we go, and that we can, wield our white skin in a way that isn't innately as harmful as it hitherto has been.
I appreciate that. And, I think, you mentioned earlier the first time you spoke, Shannon, about the importance of being vulnerable about your mistakes as a parent and transparent about your imperfection. And I think now with that example you gave of like maybe not knowing how to talk about the Bugs Bunny cartoon, like it becomes really clear why that's an important part of anti-racist parenting, right? Because if you're going to expect yourself only to have conversations about race perfectly, then you're not going to have conversations. And that's something that white parents, especially, I think, in my experience, struggle with is I don't want to open up this Pandora's box if I don't know how to close it again. And the reality is like, you're not going to close it again. And the goal shouldn't be to close it again. And just because we know each other, I'll lift up one other example of yours, if you don't mind, because it just really stuck with me. You took a couple of your kids to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Alabama, Brian Stevenson's lynching memorial and museum about racism from slavery to mass incarceration. And you told me about how at the end of seeing all of those things that are really hard to see, that at the end of the day, one of your sons was just sitting on a bench and just kind of like devastated and down and sad and just like, really feeling it. And then we
had gone to the lynching memorial,
right?
And he was 12 at the time,
Mm-hmm.
and he was just so overcome. He's like, every name is somebody that was murdered for their Blackness,
right?
And then the weight of that like hit him, and then we left from there and went to the museum downtown, and we were going through security. The security guards were Black men, and we were like going through security. And before we went into the museum, I asked my son, I was like, hey, do you want to take a few minutes before we go in? You want to like just gather yourself together, take a few minutes? And he's like, yes, I do. I was like, okay. And so he sat down, and the security guards started joking with, they're like, oh, Mom, he's having a rough day. Like, you need to get him some ice cream. And I was like, no, he's going to grow up to be a white man in America. He needs to feel these things. I'm here, and I will support him as he feels these things. But we can't ice cream this away. He has to feel this.
Thank you
And
so
then,
much.
you know, then the security guards like code switched and they were just like, yeah, you know, like, that they were all like, yeah.
That sounds
you know?
right. Yeah.
And I mean, and we did end up like, you know, having food and having some dessert or whatever, but it was like not related to this comfort. Like, I don't need to comfort away my children's discomfort about race and the realities of racism in our own lives and in America. That's not my job to make them not hurt. It should hurt. It should hurt like hell. It should hurt like something they cannot even bear.
Right.
And we should just be there as they feel that.
Thank you. And thank you for letting me put you on the spot there. We'll go to Anastasia with Rachel on deck.
One of the things I learned very quickly was empathy doesn't work. And kindness and like being good to them and modeling respect for all human beings and showing that it had to be like the flow of white supremacy is so violent and so extreme and so relentless and forceful that I had to be that, you know, I had to lean into it that with that much intensity myself, because what was happening was what I thought I was doing that was anti-racist parenting. When my children were in school, and I put them in a school, the Brooklyn Free School, where the curriculum is anti-racist from the start. It's in the first line of this is what we do at this school. So we don't get calls home, your child goofed around in math class. We get calls home, your child committed a microaggression today. This is what it looked like. This is what it sounded like. This is what we talked to them about, and we want you to come in. So it was taken so seriously. And when I started getting those calls about my kids, I was like, what in the hell is going on here? Because I thought I was modeling something for them, and all I understood from what I understood from that experience is it gets in there. So it's so insidious. It's so in every single breath in and out that it really is a spiritual crisis. It's a catastrophe and has to be addressed at that level. And like you said, this is a fight against fascism. And so it has that, the stakes are that high all the time. And once I knew that, then I could do it. Once I realized that what I was doing was not enough. So then it becomes very specific things like a book like Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, right? So I give that to my child to read, and he's like, I can't read this. It's too scary. And I'm like, what part is too scary? And he said, the nightmen. The nightmen are too scary. And that's the headlights pulling in at night to the house of the Logans. And so here's this book that children tend to be taught. I was not taught this book as a child. But so with that book in particular, right? So he's afraid of the nightmen who terrorize Black families, white men in their cars who terrorize Black families. And so I read this book with him. I read it on my own. And the way that I went at it was to have him really focus on the white child in the book who is the Jeremy character, the white child who wants to be friends with the Logans, but his proximity to them endangers their lives. It's that serious. Even to be near, they have to move away. It is a matter of life and death. But his own family is one of the most racist families in town, notorious. And so he's in this space of like lonely and trying to figure out how to be anti-racist himself in this time. So we just really, really engage with that. And then the last thing I'll say is very everyday things like how much space they take up on the sidewalk. So I live in Brooklyn, And it really bothers me when white families really spread out all over the sidewalk and the children kind of go everywhere and everybody has to step around them. And so I'm very intense about that with my kids and very deliberate. And because they know, they also know that they know I have a steady stream in my head, in my ears, on my bookshelf, and in my friendships of Black women whose authority I deeply revere and trust. And they know how conscious I need to be. And it informs, I think, there's a reverence, and it's centered. It's the center of this household, and to me, it requires that much.
Thank you so much. Rachel, could we hear from you for a couple minutes?
Oh, yeah, I'll keep it brief. So I've been hearing folks talking a lot about education. When do you start teaching your child? And as a teacher, I think a lot about education in general, right? So I think about the things I teach her at 2. I think about the places that she goes to learn. She goes to daycare, she goes to a school now. And I think about all of this in the context of how like whiteness is centered a lot of the time in educational spaces. I wanted to bring a quote that a friend of mine gave to me that was really helpful in thinking about like how to enact anti-racism in parenting and thinking about decisions you're making as a white parent for your kid. And so the question she asked me was, is their whiteness being affirmed in all that they do because of the classes, the schooling, the community setting, the play dates, the books they're reading? Or is that identity being challenged and shifted, counteracted in family and community in the extent that it could shift and change their knowing of what it means to be a white person? And so I sort of think about this in like a concrete way, just with schools. So I've taught in New York City for most of my teaching career, and also here in Chicago. But I've worked in schools with majority white staff. All the schools I've taught at had a majority students of color as the population we were teaching. But I've worked in schools with majority white staff. I've worked in schools with racially diverse staff, but still with white leadership. And then here in Chicago, I've worked in schools that were led by Black women in a mostly Black community. And there's a difference, right? So like when I was looking to put my kid in a daycare or school, it was really important to me that it was a diverse, or racially and class diverse community. But I think, and I've talked to other white parents about this, like, yeah, it's important. I want my kid to not just be around other white kids. And, you know, I think that's great. And that's like a surface level way of thinking about it, right? Because if you're going into a school and it's still run by white people, the administration's white, the teachers are white, you still have white identity centered, right? And you have white experience centered. And, you know, other folks have been talking about how we're all works in progress, and anti-racism is this work in progress. And when you're born as a white person, you're just taught all this stuff that you need to unlearn constantly over your whole life. And so they're just white people are gonna miss it, right? And the culture that's being set up, that identity is still centered, and that those minds are still the ones sort of like creating the culture and the space where kids are being educated and raised. And so it just makes me think about how that is not actually going to be, that educational space is not going to be the place where we're going to unlearn racism, right? Because even as a well-meaning white teacher, like I'm going to miss stuff, and I should not be in charge of setting the whole culture of the school. So just thinking about the layers of which white supremacy operates on, and who should be leading like educational spaces and stuff when you're looking to take your kids to a place where they're not going to be centered. Their white identity isn't going to be centered and be the one held up is sort of the norm. So
thank you so much. Anastasia mentioned that she has some that there are Black women whose work and whose voices she really reveres, and I know because we've spoken before that when you were writing your book about white supremacy, that you reached out to Loretta, and that the feedback she gave you caused you, I think, to rewrite 20 pages or so, which is a lot of work. So I do want to, and Loretta flagged earlier that she wanted to say some words about what to do with our white kids. So I want to end this portion with her, and then we'll go to Matthias for some thoughts about what to do when your racial identity and your child's racial identity don't match. But first, Loretta, can you share some wisdom with us about what we need to do with our white babies? I think you're still muted. Loretta, okay. Oh, there you go, okay.
Yeah, back when I used to do direct action against the Klan and the neo-Nazi movement, I noticed that the majority of white people that I had to work with pretty much split into two camps. First, the larger camp were the ones that wanted to ignore them. And then the very smaller camp were the white people who wanted to perform whiteness differently and didn't know how. And so I coined a concept called appropriate whiteness that started me to thinking about how to live in whiteness differently. Because what I find is that there's too much white guilt that leads to white denial of the whiteness, that then leads to the bad multiculturalism and a whole conversation I don't even want to talk about now because that's not my point. But the point is how to be appropriately white and dedicate oneself to fighting white supremacy. So you don't do it from a place of guilt, but from a place of leaning into empowerment around choosing an identity of whiteness that performs much differently. Now, what that means is that we've got to stop the white virtue signaling. Well, that's what I call it. Where, we've got this myth in our minds that we're the good white people fighting against the bad white people, and just like I'm the good black person fighting against the bad black person, and I'm the woke person fighting against the unwoke person. I mean, get the fuck over yourselves, I want to say. Because like becoming an expert cook, you gotta work hard at this stuff, you gotta study it, you gotta learn it, you gotta make mistakes, you gotta practice it. And so all your signaling does is prove that how much more you gotta learn to someone who's been doing it a while, And I'm not really trying to throw shade on people who feel the need to state those things, because that's also part of the learning curve. That is the continuum.
Miss Loretta? Miss Loretta, can you give an example of that behavior? So when you say virtue signaling, do you mean giving off your social justice resume to black people? What is
to other white people? Actually, most woke white people think the way that they do it is to brag to other white people how anti-racist they are and admonish them for not being as woke as they are, because they know better to come when I come. I mean, I hope they've grown beyond, I've got a black child, I wear a dashiki to black people. Okay, so let's assume we're past that stage. And so it's gotten to where now they understand that they've literally interpret, go talk to your people, but it's being manifested as go talk down to your people from your position of wokeness.
Thank you.
Okay, and that's really creating more enemies for us to have to fight. And it's not really helpful. So there are stages of this process. None of us have arrived at the final stage, but I think that, so when I talk about virtue signaling, yeah, there's the primitive kind. Yes, I've got a black child, I've got a black boyfriend, I wear dashikis. That's the primitive virtue signaling to people of color. But right now, what I'm talking about is how whiteness studies has produced a white guilt that becomes part of the white competition of wokeness that is not useful or not nearly as useful. I mean, it's certainly better to be in a white wokeness competition than in the Klan. But I mean, I still rather see a little more sophistication in terms of how do you effectively become appropriately white rather than perform appropriate whiteness.
I really, really appreciate that. And you said go talk to your people doesn't mean go talk down to your people. You, among other things, you described a good portion of my social media feed in a way that was much more incisive than I could have. And I really, really appreciate you sharing that. I am going to go to Matthias in a second to talk a little bit about how to navigate differences between your own racial identity and the racial identity of your child, with the obvious disclaimer that, you know, no one person's voice can speak for that entire experience, but I really appreciate you sharing your experience. I also want to just take the second to pause and share just some resources, and again, share the survey so that we can hear from all of you about, you know, how to keep doing this work better. And if you have questions for the panel, now would be the time to submit them to me. And I will, you know, as if you were filling out index cards, basically. And I'll do my best to curate those and pose one or two to the panel before we wrap up. But first, while you're thinking of questions and sending them, while you're taking note of that survey link, I also want to ask Matthias, what has your experience been, or what have you learned about navigating differences between your own race and the race of your children?
Well, I have to start by saying I definitely can't speak for everyone, but, you know, I want to acknowledge what Loretta said, that, you know, I think that there are a lot of white people who have a Black child or a biracial child who are like, well, I'm not racist, I can't be. And I think that that's the first place that you could really fall down, because we all have this racism built into us. It's the culture we were raised in. And to acknowledge that when you come up with it. And it's going to come up, I think, a lot more and maybe more profoundly when you have children of color. I think this is probably also true for just a lot of white parents of white kids. But, you know, you remember your favorite movie or something from when you're a kid, and you go to watch it with your kids and you're like, oh, this is really problematic. I didn't realize all this stuff was in here. And that part is really difficult. You know, the other piece of being a white parent of Black kids, and I don't know everyone in the audience, but I know, you know, from the company of other white people that I keep are generally people who feel quite liberal, who want to say that they're not racist, but very easily fall into doing and saying kind of racist things. I've gotten asked more times than I ever want to admit that, like, where did your children come from? Like, what do you mean, where did they come from? I didn't just order them from a catalog or something, you know, like, they're my children. But this happens all the time. And it's almost like, oh, you're so lucky to have these beautiful children that look different from you. There's kind of like this white savior thing that people want to put on white parents of Black kids. And don't buy into that. Like, knock that down right away and say, would you say this to another white person with a white child, you know? Or, you know, I mean, sometimes the things were just ridiculous, like old white women asking to touch my child's hair. And I'm like, well, can I let my 2-year-old touch your hair? Like, why are you like, does that seem appropriate? Like, put it right back on them. That question sounds ridiculous, because it is. Like, you're in a position of power here as a white person, take it and say, you are acting inappropriately. You're acting inappropriately in front of my child. And I'm going to tell you that in front of my child, because it's not okay. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you, DJ, you mentioned you have a biracial child. What kind of experiences do you have? I know you're the moderator, but.
Yeah, so my daughter's 9 months old, and we've been in quarantine for the last few months. So there haven't been a lot of strangers saying things to or about her yet. And we're also still, you know, her looks are still changing. And so it's still not clear whether she'll pass as white yet. And so thinking about what her biracial identity means, you know, it feels like that is still in flux, because the way that people read her, I think, is still in flux. But, you know, one thing that I have a lot of ambivalence about is that she, you know, her mom is Filipina, and she has her mother's eyes, and she gets compliments about her eyes just all the time. and I think my baby has beautiful eyes, and I think my wife has beautiful eyes, and I think that commenting on her eyes can be a signal of noticing something different about her and noticing something other about her. And so I don't have a great answer yet for what to do when someone says that she has beautiful eyes. But it's one of the early signals that, that we're in for a complicated ride. And I know that, and we knew that before we started. But, other things we've done right off the bat is like our board books include books that are written in Tagalog, that have Filipino faces on them. But yeah, we have a lot of work to do and a lot of hard conversations to have. So Kiana, sorry, I just saw, yeah, please jump in.
So as a parent, as a person, a Black person who's parenting with a white person, and we co-parent, we don't live together. Something that's happened that's super important for me is that Matthias speaks up for our kids even if I'm not in the room. Matthias checks people about how they talk about our kids even if I'm not in the room. So even the person of color or the Black person you're parenting with, it's not just their sole responsibility to do the Black stuff or the POC stuff. It's not their job to check the racist stuff. It's both parents' job. If I knew about an amazing event that centered Blackness and that was happening at the library, but I know I'm at work, I still try to see if Matthias can go. I'm not in charge of all things Black. Probably 85% just because of who I am, but he has a role in that. If he doesn't step into Black spaces, if he doesn't talk to them about stuff, then what they hear is that's not who I can talk to, but that's their parent, and they need to be able to have all those kinds of conversations with him that they will have with me. I wanted to just say, if you're parenting with a Black person right now or a POC person, we're tired. It's been a rough 2 weeks, baby, y'all, we tired. Give your partner some extra space. And I would say the other thing that Matthias does that I just want to acknowledge is that he honors sacred space. When I do things with Blue, Black Lives of Unitarian Universalist, some of that is sacred space and it's close to white people. And he'll say, is this appropriate? Should I be here? He questions that and doesn't say, well, I'm your white dad, so I get to be here with you because I need to be with my Black kids. He honors that there is going to be spaces and things that he is not going to be able to talk about, connect with, and honors that and empowers whomever needs to give that education or that experience to our children without him. Because it isn't about affirming his whiteness. It isn't about centering his whiteness. He's let go of that narrative if our children's growth and development is more important. So, just to think about that. How are you not only nurturing relationships? Oh, this is another point, but important. How are you not only nurturing the relationship with that person, that human, that little growing human, but also in communities of color? Do you know Black folks? Do you have a Black person who will go take your kid out to go do some Black shit? I said it. Create those experiences, and not in a performative way, but in a substantive way. I've started doing programming for youth because what I realized is some of the Black people my kids were seeing were at school and at home and at church. But guess what happened when COVID hit? They stopped going to school and they stopped going to church. So guess where they were seeing less of? Black people. So I very intentionally have created space for that, but also very intentionally, I have lunch every week with a little Black girl who I know is adopted. Every week we have lunch, noon Wednesday. I eat salad and we talk. And so it's critical and important to be present in the lives of children need affirmation, need conversation. Very important. Sorry, I'm off the bus.
There's nothing to apologize for. I really appreciate you jumping in to share that. And I think, the complexity that you lifted up with your white co-parent, I think is really important because it also applies to anybody who has any interaction with any child that is a different race than them, right? And especially to white people who teach children of color, who parent children of color. And it, if I heard you correctly, I think one of the things that you were saying is that, Matthias as a white co-parent, cannot and should not and will not avoid Blackness, right? He will call out a racist statement when it gets made. He will go to the Black-centered event, and that he can't shy away from that, even if he doesn't know it in his bones the way you do. And at the same time, he will take your lead and he will trust you and he will know that there are spaces that aren't there for him. And all of that is completely antithetical to how white people are taught to be in this world, right? And so white people, 99% of the time, are going to either be hands-off because it makes them uncomfortable, or be hands-on because they think they're in charge. And so I really appreciate the complexity that you're holding up, of showing like a middle way and showing that there's a way to be neither of those things, which is actually just to be humble, and to listen. Okay, so we have about 5 minutes left, and we have many more questions than we could possibly have time for. One question that came up that I wanted to pose to Loretta is getting back to that idea of, I know that a lot of white people are having conversations with other white people about race right now. And one of the questions that came in, Loretta, was, what is the difference between, talking down to your fellow white person, which you counseled us not to do? What is the difference between that and calling out a white person's racist behavior, or calling in that behavior? And this may be related to your upcoming book, I'm not sure, but I was just wondering if you could talk to us about the proper ways for white folks to address racism with other white folks that isn't the thing that you said we shouldn't do.
Well, first of all, one of the things around whiteness is that y'all got to give up y'all's need for certainty and absolute answers and black and white binaries and all this kind of stuff, because even how you ask for answers seems to invite that kind of thing. How you, if and when you call someone out for racism depends on how you think and what you think about their relationship to the anti-fascist movement that you're building. So if they're openly and proudly fascist, I'm not necessarily having a calling in strategy for them. I have an overpowering strategy for them. If they are, people who are on a different part of the continuum, with whom I share some of a worldview and some values around, honesty and integrity and doing the right thing, then I may lean more towards the calling in, because I don't want to leave them out there to be recruited by my opponents. If they are really in sync with me, like, okay, I'm an abortion rights activist, but you're in the Girl Scouts and don't say anything about abortion, then I'm gonna define you as a problematic ally. So my investment in you is going to be a higher investment, because you're more likely to be with me because we have that shared worldview about women and gender empowerment, then go to the other side. So there's no one answer to how you choose to respond to racism. It depends on where they are in the continuum of, intentional racist, accidental racist, oblivious racist, someone who you have to speak a certain way to because they can fund your organization racist. I mean, there's a whole continuum. And I think that's the skill that those of us who want to do anti-fascist work have to grow into, because we have to do better threat assessments and we have to have more accurate responses. So just because someone says something racist doesn't define them as my enemy. Every white person and many people of color say a lot of problematic, racist, transphobic, homophobic, blah, 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 blah stuff. But that don't make them enemies. That makes them problematic potential allies. And so those of us who profess to be woke need to broaden our toolkit and stop thinking that we can find simplistic answers and absolutes and binaries for dealing with the complex thing called how human beings think and change and make. But I do want to say one thing, because I am going on too long. One of the things that I'm learning to really problematize is this belief that is coming from a lot of white people that the best way to do radical, revolutionary work against white supremacy is through building relationships. That's nothing but the classic kith and kin system of white supremacy. I can only care about you if I know you and you know me. That ain't original. I should care about bombs being dropped in Syria if I never meet a Syrian in my life. You know, it has to go beyond who knows me and how I can get people to know. Can I meet more Black people? Can I be around more diversity? Can I do this? Can they get to know what my heart is? I mean, this whole conversation is a left-wing version of white supremacy that I would like us to push back and interrogate more.
I really appreciate you lifting that up. And I also, your earlier point really, really resonated with me too, about not looking for clear binary, not buying into binaries, not looking for, cure-alls and clear answers. And one of the things I noticed in putting this panel together, and frankly, in reading the questions that are coming in, is that a lot of white parents are approaching this from a place of wanting to be given answers, right? And I hope that everybody who was on this call felt like they got new ideas and that they learned things, that they got new resources, new ways to see things. But I also hope nobody felt like they got, all the answers that they were looking for, because to your point, Loretta, it's more complicated than that, and it's lifelong work. One of the parents who reached out to me asking me to set this up in the first place said, all the Facebook groups I'm a part of are being inundated with resources right now, and it's a lot to sort through and it's overwhelming. So could we do an event, with best practices, right? And on the one hand, like, yes, of course we can, and we did, and we are.
Let's make it a true or false test.
Right. Yeah. On the other hand, like, yes, the resources are overwhelming, and so is racism, right? And wading through those resources and finding what works and what doesn't is part of the work. And so this was not intended to give people clear and easy answers, and there aren't any. And a lot of we're running slightly over, so we have to wrap up in a second. I just want to say that a lot of the questions that came in, all came down to a version of like, how do I tell my kids the truth? No one phrased their question that way, but that I could summarize probably 80% of the questions that came to me as, how do I tell my kids the truth? And I think that each of the panelists in this panel did a really good job of explaining that. And if you didn't hear that yet, it might be because you were too uncomfortable while they were speaking. And we're going to record this and put it up on our website tomorrow, and you can listen again, because there was actually a lot of advice given for how to tell your kids the truth. And whatever your specific truth is in your family, I would hope that you could glean some ways to do that through the transparency and the vulnerability that our panelists modeled tonight. So I want to thank everybody for coming and respect our panelists' time and all of our participants' time. I gave in the chat box a survey link and would certainly love your feedback. I also put in the link for where you can find this recording on Fourth Universalist website, and we will put it up tomorrow. A lot of people have asked if they're allowed to share it. The answer is, of course, share it far and wide. Yeah, so thank you to our panelists, and thank you to our participants. Thank you for being here tonight. Much love and safety to everybody, and I hope you all continue the work.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.